A human ship returned. The galaxy paid for its mistake too late. The signal came from a sector that had been cold for 3 weeks. Sector Marshal Graal turned his saurian head toward the tracking console as the display flickered with an unregistered energy spike. 2 massive civilizational armadas sat on opposite sides of the Sunderchasm trade spine, their weapons groups locked in a silent standoff that had paralyzed all regional freight. Neither side had fired a shot since the recession began. They were waiting for a single automated navigation error to justify an all-out fleet engagement. Instead, the void rippled, and a lone patchwork patrol cruiser dropped directly between the 2 locked lines. The newcomer did not broadcast an entry sequence flag or an identification code. It simply hung in the high-density slipstream, its scarred gray hull reflecting the bright iron flare of the surrounding warships. On the opposite side of the line, Commander Vaughn watched the small vessel from his displacement calculating desk. He held his weapon groups passive, tracking the anomaly without ordering an immediate targeting tether. His tactical officers remained perfectly still. A single human ship had returned to the border lane, and the galaxy paid for its mistake too late by assuming the small craft would run. Graal leaned forward, his green scales catching the green light of his tactical grid. He struck his obsidian command stave against the deck plate, demanding an immediate compliance link from the intruder. His screens showed the vessel was tiny, barely the size of a light Vanguard escort. Its metal skin was a mess of uneven welding lines and mismatched plating that suggested multiple frontier repairs. It possessed no heavy torpedo mounts or primary plasma columns. It was a fragment of old metal sitting between 300 dreadnoughts. I wish I could tell you the grid held its peace. It did not. Stay close. 3 hours before the drop, Captain Kenneth Rails sat at a secondary terminal within the Archway outpost node. He double-capped his steel hydration flask against the rail, listening to the dull throb of the ship's primary cooling system. The container was scratched with rough volume lines that marked 4 years of frontier surveying. His pilot, a young woman named Pav, kept her fingers hovering above the manual drive toggles. They had spent 40 minutes reviewing the local node streams from the edge of the system. The Accord passenger behind them adjusted her uniform collar. Sierra had spent 3 years recording human transit habits, and her database described them as an impulsive species that lacked long-term planning models. She told Rail that entering a blocked sector with an unarmored surveyor craft was an act of civilizational suicide. She advised an immediate retreat to the nearest neutral hub until a formal trade committee could evaluate the partition. Rail did not look up from his data grid. He took a short pull from his steel flask, set it into the bulkhead bracket, and told Pav to engage the forward drive matrix. He stated that waiting for perfect variables was an elite privilege that frontier lines could not afford. Earth had spent its deep history throwing ice and drought at a species that survived by walking through the storm rather than waiting for it to clear. He told Sierra that stopping was an artificial decision for his crew, and moving forward was simply their default reflex. The Gritrunner crossed the outer boundary of the Sunderchasm at standard cruising velocity, cutting straight down the geometric center of the 2 opposing armadas. Graal watched the progress with a short, heavy hiss that passed for a laugh on his bridge. He ordered a single Vanguard destroyer to fire a high-frequency warning burst across the human ship's bow. The orange plasma spike lit up the Gritrunner's front viewport, leaving the sensor dials singing with proximity alarms. Inside the small bridge, the floor plates vibrated hard enough to loosen a deck bolt near Sierra's boots. Rail checked the internal power levels for exactly 3 seconds. He did not alter his posture or lower his eyes. He told Pav to maintain their current path and speed without shifting their defensive fields. On his right, Dover did not touch the damage control selectors. Her hands moved across a manual target override dish, aligning their primary scanning array onto the Hegemony flagship's focal communication mast. Graal did not receive a turnback signal. He viewed the continuing forward momentum of the patchwork craft as a direct insult to his authority. He did not raise his voice when he gave the next command, ordering his destroyer captain to deliver a direct disabling blow to the vessel's port side. The second shot struck the Gritrunner on its lower stabilizer seam. The main display lines dropped to dark for 2 seconds before the backup battery grids caught the load. A low groan of stressed metal echoed through the floor frames as the ship adjusted to the impact. Tin's voice came over the internal speaker from the lower deck, sounding like a mechanic discussing a loose pipe. He stated that the port field emitter had collapsed under the heat, but he was already rerouting the core power through the auxiliary exhaust lines. Dover continued her work, locking her manual frequency dish onto the hegemony command node on the far edge of the fleet. Sierra pointed at the flickering tracking screen, her voice rising as she stated that the fleet had initiated direct combat maneuvers. She demanded that Rail open a wideband withdrawal notification to prevent total vaporization. Rail stood up, tapped his empty flask against the terminal edge, and signaled his communications officer to open an unencrypted Shiroka channel to both armadas. His voice was level, carrying no heat and no fear. He identified his vessel and stated that they were operating on a legal transit course under old navigation laws. He noted that they had accepted 2 unprovoked weapon impacts from the hegemony line. He stated clearly that if another target lock registered on their hull, the Gritrunner would treat the standoff as an open war state and respond with asymmetric measures. He informed both commanders that this was their single caution, as his crew did not possess the patience to issue 2. He nodded, and the channel snapped dark. Graal stared at the blank display for 3 seconds before turning to his secondary officers. He ordered 3 separate destroyers to advance into an aggressive flanking triangle to box the Surveyor hull against the slipstream walls. The 3 capital ships surged forward, their massive automated systems locking onto the tiny craft. Across the chasm, Vaughn noted the change in Graal's deployment structure. He ordered 16 of his own dreadnoughts to slide forward, holding the open left flank that Graal had exposed to catch the human ship. The Gritrunner did not slow down as the flanking triangle closed. Tin executed his unauthorized engine modification from the lower deck, revectoring the secondary attitude nozzles to fire alongside the main drive. The small ship twitch-stepped sideways in short, violent bursts that defied its structural mass. The automated calculation loops on the hegemony destroyers began to slip, their intercept solutions requiring constant manual updates as the target shifted unpredictably. Dover watched the tracking bars on her terminal begin to waver. She fired 3 precise counter-frequency pulses from her manual dish, aiming directly at the narrow antenna clusters on the leading destroyers rather than their heavy armor plates. The target arrays on all 3 capital ships went blind simultaneously. Their automated tracking grids dropped into endless acquisition cycles, leaving their heavy gunners unable to clear a fire solution. By the time the destroyer captains switched to visual backup systems, Pav had guided the Gritrunner directly between 2 of the closing hulls. The proximity was so tight that firing on the human ship would risk hitting their own wingman across the lane. The patchwork cruiser was now floating inside the dense core of Graal's forward group. Graal screamed into his local comms, ordering 40 additional screening vessels to break formation and converge on the intruder's position. The convergence turned the tight hegemony blockade into a crowded knot of drifting metal. The instant subspace telemetry links that coordinated Graal's ships began to lag, clogged by the constant rerouting of data around the blind destroyers. Dover identified the primary command mast she had flagged during the entry approach. She released a concentrated energy spike that decoupled the localized tracking mesh from the regional relay nodes. The effect was not an explosion, but a sudden silence across the hegemony communication lines. The tight coordination signals that allowed 200 ships to act as a single machine went dark, leaving individual captains waiting for instructions that did not arrive. 4 separate cruisers tried to turn into the chasm, but their timing was off by several seconds, forcing their neighbors to reverse engines to avoid a fleet collision. Vaughn sat back at his calculation desk, watching the massed hegemony line dissolve into an uncoordinated cluster of blind giants. He told his tactical staff that the humans were demonstrating an old frontier strategy of attrition by irritation. They were not attempting to destroy a superior navy, they were converting the enemy's massive scale into a costly operational liability. Every minute Graal spent chasing a ghost was a minute his flank remained open to a real strike. The Gritrunner continued to drift through the flagship's defensive screen, its attitude jets scorching the polished green plating of Graal's personal vanguard unit. Tin's voice cracked over the intercom again, reporting that the drive coils were running hot enough to melt their casings, but he had discovered a third way to override the safety valves. Rail stood at the center of his bridge, his eyes fixed on the crumbling fleet structure on his display. Sierra watched the terminal grids reset, her fingers resting against the metal casing as she realized her entire assessment report was wrong. She had classified humanity as a low-threat, emotional species that would fracture under systemic military pressure. Now she saw that pressure was their natural environment. They did not require a structured plan to win an engagement. They simply required their opponent to become tired of the calculation. Graal opened a private data channel directly to the Gritrunner, his voice tight with the strain of a commander losing control of his sector. He stated that the hegemony was prepared to alter its local screening parameters if the human ship ceased its telemetry disruption. Rail took his steel flask from the bracket, tapped it twice against the console rail, and answered that the disruption would end when the blockades were permanently lifted from the freight lines. The standoff ended 4 hours after the first drop. Graal ordered his units back to their original defensive markers, his tracking screens showing 23 of his vanguard ships disabled or pulled out of alignment by their own manual steering corrections. Vaughn held his passive line, refusing to exploit the exposed flank as long as the trade spine remained open to civilian registration. The Gritrunner cleared the exit node of the Sunder Chasm, its patchwork hull moving toward the outer stars without a single casualty reported. 4 days later, the automated relay stations along the border networks carried the unverified logs of the engagement to 42 Allied worlds. The high-level registries in the central chamber updated their files before the first political committee could open a session. Sierra completed her new report on an empty logistics desk at Vane Station 9, striking through 60 pages of old assessment data with a heavy black ink pen. Paul sat in the small diplomatic office near the terminal gates, sorting through more incoming communication tokens than his staff had received during the entire unification recession. He looked up as the final regional reclassification document printed onto the stack, changing the human security rating to Tier 1 with no preconditions listed. He left the ledger open on the desk, the ink word facing toward the window where the freight transports were already realigning their courses. Rail stood by the small viewport of the Gritrunner as the first commercial convoys began to stream through the open Sunder Chasm lane. The ship was quiet now, save for the steady click of Tin's wrench against the lower manifold filters. Sierra walked up beside him, her long report sheets tucked under her arm as she looked out at the moving lights. She stated that the empires would remain afraid of his people for another generation. Rail did not look back at her. He double-tapped his fingers against the worn frame of the window, watching a heavy freighter pass the exact point where the hegemony flagship had sat blank 3 days before. He told her that fear was a predictable variable that his crew could easily calculate during a run. He reached into his pocket, set the dry steel hydration flask on the recording stand, and turned back to the navigation terminal. The word faced up on the empty desk. Counted.